Hello. Today I'd like to take a look at a topic that I'm going to term or entitle, "Why have some people flocked to places like America or California as lands of opportunity, or Shangri-Las, or lands of milk and honey? And what type of person in particular most likes to flock to such places? Or even say that the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, when some others are less prone to saying that and doing actions in pursuant of that idea." I'd like to preface this talk by saying I have particular special experience with this because my grandparents and mother were immigrants to America from war-torn Europe. Having come here, my mother included, at age 12 in 1950, from war-torn Europe, both Poland and Germany, having lived in both places and suffered greatly during the war. And some of these relatives, having decided that America would be a great place to restart their lives, and in essence calling America Shangri-La, and wanting to come here, and having done so, in fact. Well, this is one case of what I would call fleeing very difficult circumstances or very painful circumstances once having been experienced. One may, for instance, be in a war-torn region and want to flee oppression or general conditions that are very, very distressing. Or we might not be talking physical war, but mental war, whereby many people who have come to America early on were the pilgrims, say, who were fleeing oppression in terms of persecution religiously. In fact, it was quite surprising to me to read several months ago that Christianity and the Christians in general are the most persecuted group throughout the world today. Very surprising. You would think, for instance, that we're much more enlightened than to have that much persecution of any group in general, let alone Christians. But such fleeing from religious persecution hasn't only happened with people in Europe coming to America, and thus these called pilgrims, but even within America after, let's say, the 1800s, when the Mormons, for instance, went west to Utah, again fleeing persecution, if you will. Indeed, there are some people who would say that this kind of fleeing in general can take place within one's community, in one's home, and such people can be called isolationists, or loving to isolate themselves in general from, you might call, toxic conditions, especially fearful people of violence, wanting to isolate within their own homes, even not having to go out west like the Mormons did or flee to another country, but just cocooning in their own homes, perhaps, especially after work, when so many Americans come home and lock their doors and bar their doors, turn on their alarm systems. So, in a sense, doing the same thing that the Puritans and the Mormons did, to a more socially acceptable manner, perhaps, and more commonplace manner. I'm also going to throw in a little tidbit for consideration and thought in general. I watched a movie years ago, a British movie, perhaps, Ladies in Lavender. And at one point, it was mentioned that certain people were the sweepings of Europe. Perhaps they were talking about Americans or people who had come to America being the sweepings of Europe in rather condescending a manner, perhaps, to call anyone a sweeping. In other words, something you would sweep off the street. Now, why someone persecuted or having gone through a lot of trauma of other nature, like in a war setting, would be called sweepings is beyond me, unless you were to say that some people handle toxic conditions much less well than others and wish to flee. But at any rate, how can we blame them for being less able to handle stress than some others, I would say, for reasons that are a little more complex than I wish to go into right here. But at any rate, it seems incontrovertible to me that some people, by no fault of their own, go through war trauma or religious persecution simply by being a minority member of a religious viewpoint, and thus experience much difficulty and understandably wish to reduce many aspects of discontent mounted against them by leaving that environment and, let's say, coming to America, which is then a big part of what I'm going to be discussing, why America has been considered the Shangri-La for so many traumatized people throughout the world, I would say, either from war-torn situations or religious persecution in general. Well, it strikes me that one of the first things obvious to me about coming to America as a Shangri-La or way of coping from your past, let's say from a war-torn situation in Europe or other areas of the world, is that America was, at one time anyway, very inaccessible to the rest of the world. There was no way of getting here easily. Ships, for instance, were the only way for many people until the last century. Even my mother, say, who emigrated here at age 12 in 1950, came here by ship, steamliner. It took at least 12 days. They did not come by airplane. And furthermore, prior to their evacuating, so to speak, to America, my mother evacuated her small town during World War II by covered wagon and horse. So again, it not being so easy to leave compared to today, when you can simply hop in a car or get on board an airline, and often very cheaply too. Indeed, the only way my relatives were able to come to America is because a rich relative sponsored them and was here first. Otherwise, even this would never have happened. Whereas today, it's very easy to leave and go to some so-called Shangri-La, including what many Americans consider California to have been at one time a Shangri-La in the U.S., by simply getting on a Greyhound bus very cheaply, or a car. Not a steamship that costs a lot of money and takes a long time. Additionally, there were no railroads until the 1800s. So this form, too, of leaving certain areas and going to other areas was also not an option, and the only real option then was walking on foot or taking a horse. Hence even the idea of the Pony Express mail delivery service before railroads came into existence, as opposed, of course, to delivering mail to the West on foot. Another factor, for those having gone through much trauma, either on a battlefield or suffering from religious oppression, perhaps, or other forms of oppression, too, being a minority in any sense, is that leaving somewhere else to somewhere else could be considered an adventure, something radically different, at least a risk to take, a hope of something being different. And who doesn't like an adventure, especially when life otherwise looks hopeless? Why not go on an adventure as the last possible option? Yet a third reason, I think, why so many have come either to America, or if in America going to, say, a Shangri-La idea like California, is the promise of easy money. And why would America be considered a place to make easy money or get a lot of money? Well, for the following reasons, I believe. First, that there were far fewer constraints on how you can make it. What I mean by that is there were very few laws here in America in the 1600s compared to Europe, for instance. Why would this be? Well, because the white man generally wasn't here before the 1600s. So white man's laws were not here, only the Indians' laws, which incidentally were much less restrictive than European or anyone else's laws in general. And of course this is, in my mind, beyond dispute for one big reason, that Indians, for instance, Native American Indians, if you will, did not believe anyone should own land, that it was basically owned by the Great White Spirit, and that it was open to all people. Hence, right here, the concept of restrictive laws being far fewer when white men from Europe came here. And so there really were no laws here compared to Europe, hence it being very easy to make money because so few things were considered against the law because there were no laws established. Whatever laws were here were brought here. And you might say picked and chosen to suit the Puritans' desires, as opposed to the society in Europe in general. And so there were no laws here in America in the 1600s concerning land or, let's say, slavery. And then what a potent combination to say there were no laws against slavery or seizing of Indian lands in general, or also the factor that farming, to include farming of tobacco and cotton, were more feasible in the south of America by way of our climate than in the northern European climate, where, if I'm guessing correctly, cotton would generally not grow, or tobacco, but it would in the south of America. So this too being a potent source of money to be had here early in American times. The raising of lucrative crops like tobacco and cotton because of the special climate here in America compared to Europe, where many who came here had been from previously. Of course, too, there was the factor of much open land in general in America, and of course it being unowned, because of course the Indians didn't claim ownership of it. And there were so fewer numbers of people here in general compared to Europe, which was getting highly crowded even in the 1600s in comparison to America. Furthermore, the land here, as per quality of soil, had not really been exhausted one bit. Much of it never farmed, compared to that in Europe, which perhaps had been used with the same crops over and over and over again. And so again, farming here much more profitable just in that fashion alone. And so the conditions were rife here for things like the seizure of Indian lands, in other words, acquiring property basically for free, and for what you might call robber barons to create or come into existence, to include people like Andrew Carnegie. Another reason, I would say, too, suddenly coming to my mind, besides people fleeing Europe, say, or other parts of the world for reasons of war oppression, war trauma, or religious oppression, has to do with fleeing because of crop failure or industrialization moving in. The first idea I mentioned now, crop failure having happened to the Irish, for instance, in the 1840s, when their entire potato crop failed due to some kind of blight, and having existed financially so much just on this one crop, found themselves destitute beyond imagination, and in desperation came to America in large numbers. But the same concept applying to the moving in of industrialization in Europe, particularly England, for instance. For I was amazed to watch a video a year ago on Andrew Carnegie and discover why he and his family came here. For his father had once been a weaver, perhaps of tablecloths and other items, a fine craftsman, until such time as the mechanical looms came in as part of industrialization sweeping Europe and England in particular, which decimated this man's small business as a weaver because the looms took over, so to speak. And having seen the handwriting on the wall, his wife in particular, if I remember correctly, decided America would be a much better place to be, to survive and thrive, and so they came here. So this then being a third or fourth reason why so many have come here to America, for better or worse for their situations, as opposed to trying to adapt, like some others might have tried to, or many people not facing the same circumstances at all in Europe or other parts of the world in general. I would add at this point, I find a curious phenomena having taken place sometimes, that those ironically having fled oppression or some kind of traumatic situations have often come to America and repeated the same scenario upon others in order to survive and thrive, ironically forgetting why they left their country in the first place and came here. For consider the signature example of Andrew Carnegie, who became perhaps the wealthiest man ever in the world in relative terms. But how many people know, I certainly didn't until a year ago, that Andrew Carnegie made his money basically off of steel. But not only steel, but through practices in his industry that squashed many people, and including the killing of some people who were against him in his own industry. Not to mention practices he engaged in to quash all competition in general from other industry leaders in steel. Furthermore, the money he made from steel, of gargantuan proportions economically, would never have happened unless the steel were used in the war industry, namely the Civil War. And indeed, after this, Mr. Carnegie was aghast at how he had made all this money through promoting war, for instance, in general, and toured Europe at one point, and tried to correct the situation, and in fact lived out the rest of his life in guilt and shame and depression over how he had made this money. And so, ironically, he and his family had left Scotland destitute and hoping for a better life, because they were oppressed by what you might call the industrialists, who brought in the looms and industrialization in general. But he came here then and repeated the process, at first without thinking and later with much guilt, even to the extent that he gave away almost every penny to charitable institutions like libraries in particular, but making sure to have his name put on the library as having been funded by Carnegie, or Carnegie Hall having been funded by him too. I'm also reminded of having watched several times the movie Gone with the Wind, where one of the characters, labeled or termed Scarlett O'Hara, had suffered much loss from the Civil War and the loss of a spouse. And to compensate, turned to hiring later on convicts, if you will, at dirt cheap prices to make easy money. And in the movie, she was criticized by at least one person for having done so, because these convicts were treated very poorly. But she said in the movie, "I'll do anything not to be poor again, because I never want to be poor like I once was." Which again reminds me of Andrew Carnegie and his family in Scotland at one point in time. How ironic then that Scarlett O'Hara would have felt oppressed by poverty and losses in general, but not care how she escaped this by imposing the same conditions on others, which I find so interesting about us human beings in general, to one extent or another. Finally, I would give the example of my grandmother, who, having come from war-torn Europe, where she had to beg for potato peels at one point in time, farmhouse to farmhouse, while the war was going on, fleeing from certain enemies, her having said in America thereafter, "Make sure you lick your plate clean, or kind of words to that effect, don't waste any food, because she felt, again, I will never let happen to me what happened to me that one time in my life, whether we're talking no food or oppression in the case of Andrew Carnegie, and in the movie Scarlett O'Hara appearing in Gone with the Wind. In all cases, people having suffered terribly and saying, I will never let this happen again. And in many cases, some people saying, no matter what I have to do to make that happen. Sadly, this being human nature all too often, I'm afraid. Now, at this point in this talk, I would go on to give some personal experience from my own life, too, not just from my relatives or observations of some others from Europe. And that is that at age 26, I, too, became an emigrant of sorts, having left Kentucky and going to California, whereby I thought California would be the land of milk and honey, or the new America for me, without having to leave America. Indeed, in Kentucky at least, or some other areas, to go to a place like California was even discouraged or envied as either a pipe dream or, again, something enviable to be done. There have even been people who have led or left certain areas in Kentucky and gone to New York City and been envied as going to a supposed Shangri-La again. But what would make then California so appealing to me and so many others, especially if you had gone through hard times? Well, one thing that applied in my situation is that California was where a lot of great high-tech jobs were. At least at that point in time for me, some 35 years ago, where there was, quote, Silicon Valley. And today, though, Silicon Valley being available in other places of the country too, not just California, as per the San Francisco area, say. There is, for instance, Seattle, or places in Arizona. But consider, too, that California was a great deal more isolated in a sense than where I was presently. And isolation in general being so desirable to people who have been oppressed or hurt and are seeking escape in some way. Another factor being, of course, California's reputation for great climate. Hence, an interesting fact I ran across a couple years ago, that one of the reasons California has such a huge problem with the homeless, so to speak, is because the climate is so good there that you can literally sleep out in the open and not freeze to death, or be out in the open in general without having to really bundle up or get sick from cold weather. And of course, it appealing to many who hate hot weather, as long as you stay out of the desert parts, for instance, of California. Of course, a number of places in California often also having low heating costs compared to the northeast of the U.S., for instance, or that including New York City, for instance. Los Angeles, then, essentially having no heating costs compared to New York City. Another great draw, rendering California a supposed Shangri-La for some, is its great beauty, supposedly anyway. To include many opportunities for oceanfront experiences, whether the beaches or homes on or near the beach, or there are being many mountain areas too. Great opportunities in general for people who love nature or beauty. Finally, California has a certain mystique to it, whereby that's where Hollywood is, of course, right? And all the high-tech giants. Again, Silicon Valley. So those wishing to have a Shangri-La, not only wishing so because of amenities, but because of the status it can confer, whereby in the back of one's mind one associates oneself with Hollywood and Silicon Valley and big titans of creativity in general. And that's kind of thus acquiring a sudden degree or veneer of sophistication simply by saying one now lives in California. Now I would close this talk, with a few observations that I find curious, let's say, in a minimum sense. First, that this opportunity for Shangri-Las or fleeing is rapidly coming to a close in the world today, I believe, due to advances in both transportation and communications, whereby, for instance, we now have not only trains, but buses and automobiles and airplanes and helicopters, such that the only places difficult to access now are either the northern portions of Bush, Alaska, if you will, or Antarctica, or maybe some parts of the Amazon, whereby I've seen videos, perhaps by National Geographic or other, of people traversing in the Amazon only by taking a motorboat up the Amazon River hundreds of miles in isolated territory. I've never heard yet of someone taking a helicopter, perhaps, to get in the deep interior of the jungles of the Amazon, unless done so perhaps by loggers and other concerns for oil mining or whatever. Otherwise, it still being a Shangri-La or place hard to reach. My final observation on all of this would be this, and I leave it as a question. What happens if a supposed Shangri-La, or place many who have been traumatized or suffered greatly consider to be grass greener than their side of the fence, become populated with too many people who have suffered such emotional difficulties? For instance, when I lived in California, I found many people there in comparison to many other regions I had lived in to be without family often, very unstable situations in general. Hence again the concept of California having had many homeless people, so to speak, but for a variety of reasons, including so many with so few family members, so little stability emotionally. And California, too, having a certain regard amongst many as a place with a higher than average number of what you'd call narcissists. Again, people who have suffered much trauma, perhaps, or other difficulties in life compared to some. And so what happens when a region is regarded once as a Shangri-La, but accumulates too many people who have had high levels of trauma or difficulties, and then this whole region becomes rather toxic, on a social level at least, either with too many people with too few family members, or too much emotional trauma, or too many homeless, so to speak. Now, this could be conceived of as just a California situation, and indeed there are videos now talking of how life is way too expensive for living in California for most, especially in San Francisco or LA. But also, what about America? My contention being that perhaps America has many problems that many countries don't have, because we have so many people here who came here originally thinking it would be a great Shangri-La, and perhaps it was in the short run for them. But what happens if a country as a whole accumulates too many people who have had oppression or other difficulties in their lives? What happens when a country as a whole accumulates too many such persons, like California had at one point in time? This is something I've pondered and would put out again as food for thought, one of my favorite phrases to put out in some of my messages here. What happens if a region or even a country accumulates too many people who have had great difficulties in life and struggle greatly? I wish you a good day.